diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you. Live from Maryland Public Television, this is Direct Connection with Jeff Salkin.
Good evening. Welcome to Direct Connection. We begin tonight with a day of mourning and a call to action. In Houston today, the viewing for George Floyd was held. Meantime, in Washington and Annapolis, lawmakers are proposing legislation to address police violence and discrimination. Joining us tonight, Senator Will Smith, the chairman of the State Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. Also, Tyrone Powers, retired FBI and college professor. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for being with us. Senator Smith, if I can begin with you, this is a tough ask, but in just a minute or so, summarize the bills that you're planning to introduce.
Well, good evening. Thanks a lot for having us. And just the top lines are that we've kind of been in this place before in 2015 after the death and the murder of Freddie Gray and the uprising in Baltimore. We took a hard look at this, and over the course of the last couple of years, the legislature, I did some research, passed around 21 measures for police accountability and transparency. But obviously, we haven't gone far enough, and there's so much more we can do. And the letter that I wrote to my colleagues and my constituents was really used to harness some of that political will that we might have now, and to do some soul searching to push some meaningful structural reform based on some of the systems that have given us the byproduct, the racist, the byproduct that we've had for decades. And so just very quickly, the proposals range from everything from disclosure of personnel records, use of force requirements, demilitarization of the police, intervention, excessive force, bystander intervention, independent investigations for police misconduct, and looking at some insurance issues to provide some sort of a financial incentive for local jurisdictions and even for cities like Baltimore City that self-insure to have a greater oversight and responsibility for the misconduct of officers. So in a nutshell, all of these ideas have been before the legislature before, and my goal with the letter was to kickstart the legislative process and to incorporate the ideas of folks that have, like Senator Jill Carter, like Senator Charles Sidnor, like Delegate Alonzo Washington and Delegate Gabe Acevedo, and I could go on and on. But to incorporate those ideas that those members have had, put them on paper, kickstart the process, and then allow them to come before the legislature when we come back with a refined product and renewed energy.
Dr. Powers, what on that list or on any other list would make a difference in the short term rather than something that's going to take years to make a difference?
Well, the monitoring of the police departments and the police officers. In other words, first-line supervisors are so key, and the commissioners and the chiefs are so key, because if they draw a bright yellow line and say this behavior will be unacceptable, these are the policies that are in place, and make first-line supervisors responsible for all of those that they supervise. I had a sergeant when I was with the Maryland State Police who used to say to us before we went out, don't go out and get me in trouble tonight, not don't go out and get you in trouble, because my pension is on the line. So he was like the coach of a team, and anything we did, he was going to be held responsible for. And so to bring those first line supervisors in to say, here is the bright yellow line, here is how we do constitutional policing, and not only will the people who are involved directly in the transgressions be in trouble should we have transgressions, but you will be in trouble, and you will be in trouble, and say the same thing to the police commissioner and the police chiefs. There are policies in place now. There are use of force, continuum use of force policies, police brutality policies. There's training in place now that can get better, but they have to be implemented, they have to be enforced, and they have to be monitored by the legislature. And I think some of what the senator said in terms of some legislation that he's thinking about or trying to implement will help do that. But a frank conversation between the legislators and the police chiefs about making sure that they police constitutional. That's foundational and fundamental, that will and police in a way that is non-discriminatory.
Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question or would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call. We'll have the number up on the screen, or send us an email. Email address is livequestions@mpt.org. One of the shocking things, a lot of shocking things, but in the Floyd case, the idea that the accused officer reportedly had 18 complaints in his file. And this is 5 years past Freddie Gray. So you wouldn't think that would be the case around here, but it's surprising that it's the case anywhere. What's going to make a difference there?
I'll say this, that one thing that's dangerous is, I mean, a lot of the system, right? And the history of our nation is universal and the same across jurisdiction. But some of the rules and some of the kind of the standards and policies that we have in place here in Maryland and then all throughout the 24 jurisdictions and then all the municipalities are different. And so it's hard to draw a directly like analogous example from that situation. But I will say this: part of the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights does allow for the expungement of those non-sustained disciplinary records after 3 years. And those are also considered personnel records and therefore not discoverable by the MPIA, the Maryland Public Information Act. And so that's been a point of contention for the legislature because that's a collectively bargained for right, if you will. And so if the legislature were to go in and say, hey, look, those records, whether they're sustained or not, then those are going to be discoverable or releasable to the public. And so that's a big point of contention that I think that this moment that we have in has given us the political will to kind of push past that. But those records, for instance, even for unsustained charges, in certain instances can be instructive because they can demonstrate patterns of behavior. And if there are patterns of behavior, that's good for law enforcement leadership. That's good for the chiefs. That's also good for oversight for the legislature and for the citizens. We also like to have citizens more involved in that process. The LEOBR kind of curtails that process as well for citizen involvement or for independent investigation or for subpoena power. So there are so many things that we can look at within that 14-page Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights that we can have real progress and transparency and restore some trust with the communities, particularly communities of color, and the law enforcement officers. I just want to say this again. I think law enforcement is a laudable profession and it's real public service. This isn't aimed at the individual officers per se. This is aimed at institutions and structures and systems. And so the package that we'll be entertaining when the legislature comes back in will all be aimed toward refining and retooling a system. It's not an assault on police officers per se.
And I think there's a culture. I do believe there's a culture in policing that allows for that. In other words, you can't look at the records of individual officers outside that may be expunged after 3 years, but police chiefs and police commissioners can look at them every single year and make decisive decisions right now about which officers should be on the street and which officers shouldn't be on the street. So you can hold commissioners and chiefs responsible right now without changing how records, and I know that is a process that we should look at. The Police Officers Bill of Rights, you really do need to be examined and changed. But in the meantime, because we don't have the luxury of time, we can immediately begin to say, chiefs, you will look at those records. There's nothing that forbids you or the people in your department or the people in the different divisions from looking at those records and making sure the police officers that have numerous complaints, and I think you will find that in places like Baltimore that have numerous complaints should not be on the street. And we're going to hold you responsible to making sure, because if we find out at some point that some officer who violates someone's constitutional rights, that you have not set a culture of policing that is constitutional, that this person have had numerous complaints, we're going to come to you because we weren't able to see them and maybe the public wasn't able to see them, but you're in a leadership position and you need to make sure that the object of police is to protect and serve all the time. And as Frank Serpico said up in New York, there's no such thing as a crooked cop. Either you're a crook or a cop, and it's your responsibility, the first line supervisor's responsibilities, the commander's responsibilities to make sure we don't have a combination of a crook and a cop anywhere in our departments. That can be done immediately.
I couldn't agree more. I just, sorry to just get in real quick, but I couldn't agree more. But and as far as the public accountability piece, we won't know if those chiefs are doing their jobs and reviewing those records accordingly if we don't have access to them ourselves.
No, I agree. I agree with that.
All right, email question along the lines of something I was going to ask. This is from David. Your guests mentioned police chiefs and mayors, but what can be done when police unions are obstacles to reform? So, Senator, I'll ask you how big a role the unions and the FOP and their lobbyists play, but they're not the ones voting. And the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, somebody puts in a bill to either amend it or repeal it every session, and it obviously nothing much changes. So there is support for that, at least conceptually. Where's it coming from?
Well, that's what I was talking about in my letter, about harnessing this moment to garner the political will to do and to have some of those tough conversations that we've had in the past but have never been pushed forward enough. And so that's exactly it. It starts at the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights with respect to those records and those investigations. And so that's where the real hurdles have been, because it's a politically tough conversation to have within labor and the Democratic Party, which controls both the House and the Senate through supermajorities. So that's a tough conversation that I'm hoping that my colleagues will come along with the folks that have been leading these efforts for the last several years and harness this moment and have that political will to have those tough conversations and make those tough political decisions. That's really been the main obstacle. But I will say this. In terms of reform with respect to transparency, that's good and that's a critical step, but that's like kind of ex post. That's after something has already happened. And so a lot of what the doctor is talking about, I really respect, and that's a lot of the reforms we're going to have to look at are prospective, so that the officers have the right training, have the right accountability measures real time, and they feel like they can trust and lean on their superiors for guidance. And the communities feel like they're involved in that process simultaneously, so that there is that development of trust. And so that's I want to keep our eye on that ball too, because we want to do preventative. And that's where, we haven't talked about this yet, but that's where the quote unquote, like the defund the police movement comes from. There's a spectrum there, from pure dismantling police departments, which I think is not a viable option, to retooling and restructuring and thinking about retooling how we think about policing. Maybe the police aren't the right people to respond to someone having a mental health crisis. Maybe those resources are better channeled there. And there, I could give you example of maybe the officers that are called upon to do so many things. They shouldn't be the first responders for certain situations. And that's where those resources can be going. But the police are responsible for our safety and our prosperity, and they are essential. It's real public service. So I don't want to go down that route, but I just think there are two parts of that conversation.
Many of the young officers that I've spoken to consistently talk about supervision, their first-line supervision. Remember, policing is the only field where you can actually have the authority to remove another human being from existence based on your training and judgment. And so the training has to be tight and right. You become a police officer at 21. All of us know what we were like at 21. So unless the supervision, the first-line supervision, not just the commanders you have to choose these people. A lot of times we get promoted to these first-line supervision roles based on passing a test and based on how great of a police officer you were. But as you know, Senator, managing a number of people is different from managing yourself. You may be a very effective police officer, so putting things in place to promote them without giving them leadership responsibility with young officers who we're recruiting, because we need new officers. It's a noble profession. But officers are saying, especially in cities like Baltimore, we have a consent decree. I don't know what I can or can't do, and neither does my supervisor. So I'm feeling awkward by being in the community that I want to help and not knowing what I can do. And then when I go to my supervisor, he can tell me or she can tell me how to fill out a report, how to dot my I's and cross my T's, but they can't tell me how to effectively police and build great police community relations. So I think that is something we can do immediately. And chiefs know that. I know Michael Harrison here in Baltimore City knows that they need to, there's some things that policy takes place that you can do in the legislature, that we can do long term. Defunding policing is not necessarily a good option. The police unions, they are unions that their first goal is to make sure the people are served. They're police officers before they're part of a union. I understand protecting the salaries of police officers, making sure they get the benefits, but they should be intimately involved in the solutions of protecting and serving first, and then protecting police officers second. That's
Gentlemen,
not mutually exclusive.
Let me jump in. I just want to get to a phone call. George on the line from Anne Arundel County. George, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to just give one preamble, and that is that what makes George Floyd's death most important, and not to diminish it, but it's all the thousands who had to die before him before we got to this point. My question, though, is why can't we make for our police department a requirement that their number one job when they're going to have contact with anyone is they have their cameras on, and if the camera isn't on, then they are essentially guilty until proven innocent. They'll have their
George,
day in court,
I'm
but
glad you
the
called.
judge
That's a
needs
terrific question. And I did want to ask the guests, obviously cell phones have made all the difference in the world. Back in the days when I was a street reporter, we got complaints about police brutality issues all the time. And it was, you know, he said, she said, there was no proving it. So those cameras are making a difference. Are the officer body cameras making a difference? And what did you think about the caller's idea?
Sure.
I think the cameras can make a difference and will make a difference once we have a consistent policy about when they need to be turned on and turned off, and once officers become more familiar with them. Because actually, not only can they protect citizens, but they can protect the officers who are doing the right thing. The good police officers want bad police officers off the force. They don't know how to confront that because they're trying to keep the team concept. We're all in blue. He might have to protect my life. But they actually want somebody to do something about bad police officers. And I think the cameras being on all the time, making that a mandate, and making it a mandate from policy from the legislature, but also pushing and enforcing and talking to these police chiefs about making sure that's a mandate starting tomorrow, starting right now. Because again, we can't afford this to happen before the legislature go back in session or before next week. We need that to happen immediately. And it seems like it's something that every chief in the state of Maryland could come out and say right now without harming their police department. And it could actually be a benefit to both. Obviously, it's a benefit to the community because we've seen what cameras have done, but it could also be a benefit to police officers, good police officers who are doing the right thing.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Tyrone Powers, ex-FBI college professor, and State Senator Will Smith, chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. He would welcome your input. You can find him online. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And Direct Connection continues in just a moment.
Drop your phone and just be in the moment.
You guys ready?
It's a thrill to see images of a new world for the first time.
I want to look back and say, I learned something. That is where transformation happens.
I see people cry on this show, and I'm like, what y'all doing, man?
Out of the water came this giant thing.
That's incredible.
I feel it in my bones.
It's so totally amazing.
Feel it in my bones. And I know it constant.
They hear that song and they're like, that's my story.
I feel it in my bones.
I have chills.
I feel it in my bones.
All of the joys, all of the sorrows.
This is where it comes from.
The rest is history.
I feel it in my bones.
Joining us for our Your Health segment this week is Dr. Wilbur Chen, an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and an infectious diseases expert. Doctor, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me here, Jeff.
I have a bunch of very practical, ground level questions about dealing with the coronavirus, but let me start with a big picture question, if I can, which is that the numbers that we're seeing continue to get better. We're still losing people every day to this disease, but people are getting back outdoors. There's a feeling that maybe this is ending. Is it ending?
Wow, great question, for which I don't have a crystal ball for the answer, but it looks like that all the trends over the past few weeks are going in the right direction. We're seeing less cases being identified, despite the fact that we're testing more and more people. We're seeing less hospitalizations and less deaths. Now, one death is too much, but at least we're seeing that these numbers are trending downward. Your next question might be, well, what was it due to? And is it because of all of the measures that we've implemented, the mitigation measures, which is closing down schools and making people work from home, and other things, or is it the climate, the increased temperature and humidity? And it might be both components that are contributing to it. I think, again, we're seeing that a lot of countries continue to have cases that are rising dramatically. So I like to think that a lot of the mitigation, the kind of social components that we've built in, physical distancing, masking, are important components to why we're seeing positive trends now.
I read that you're an avid tennis player. How do you do that? Which doesn't seem terribly unsafe, but what measures do you take to protect yourself on the tennis court?
Well, I'm not sharing water bottles with anyone else, and I'm not sharing my equipment. And so tennis is one of those sports where you can't play it solo, but you can play it in such a way that you're really not having to share equipment. You do have to touch the ball, but that just means that I'm not touching my face after I touch the ball, and I'm cognizant of that. We can always plan to have hand sanitizer that's available near the court. And again, rather than shaking hands after a good game, you can always, wish them well with another means by signaling to them with a wave or something else and a nice smile.
And outdoors, way safer than indoors. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that, again, it's summer is upon us, and so being outdoors is healthy. Being active is healthy. So, being indoors cooped up in the wintertime, there's less activities that we can be engaged in. So now that it's summer, we can be out and about. But again, I would recommend that people engage in those sports that are solo sports, or sports where you just need very few numbers and where you don't have contact. So no contact sports.
There seems to be less concern at the CDC level about surfaces and catching the disease that way. I wonder, and I worry about it in terms of getting food. If you just grab a hamburger somewhere and somebody in the kitchen coughed on it, can I get the coronavirus that way?
Well, I suppose the kitchen should be also wearing a mask as well, just as much as you would expect them to wear a hairnet these days, for preparation of your food. But the point is that they have to touch your food in order to prepare it, and they have to put it into containers. I'm presuming that this is takeout or delivery. So again, some people take the measure of making sure that when they get their carry out and delivery and bring it home, that they carefully spoon out the food onto their own dishes and discard of the container. Some people will wipe down the container, but I think, again, if the container is done with and you're serving your food, put it on a nice platter and get rid of it, and then wash your hands again. I think, again, just being cognizant of surfaces as a potential transmission. Now that it's summer and we're outdoors, we know that the UV light may have a component for inactivating the viruses. So when we enjoy a nice picnic, and I would encourage people to go outdoors and to be able to eat outdoors, again, we're not sharing food, but we need to be cognizant of the person who's preparing the food, delivering it, in the carry-out situation.
How concerned should people participating in protests be about the coronavirus? They have other concerns on their mind, of course, but you have situations where you have a lot of people maybe forced into tight quarters. There may be, tear gas or irritants like that. You would advise wearing a mask.
I would advise wearing a mask and maybe even an eye shield as well, because we don't know what's being thrown into the air and inadvertently getting caught in the face with something. Just talking about the protests, I think that there are a lot of injustices that have been longstanding, and so I certainly understand that people want to go out there and demonstrate, their resolve about this situation. And so it's not that I am against, protesting, but I certainly am concerned that I want to protect everyone who wants to demonstrate, to try as best as possible to physically distance and to mask. And again, this is a situation where under these situations, I think even the demonstration of a hug or a handshake is a positive demonstration of support, which I think is needed for the nation. So even though that goes against what I've been preaching, which is, trying to stop transmission of the virus. So I think, again, when we talk about public health, I think we talk about how social injustice is a part of health as well. And that when we try to tackle these two things, they sound like that they're opposed to each other. But I think, again, I'm trying to balance out kind of the principles of trying to stop the virus, but also address what is a social injustice and how we address that as well as a nation.
Dr. Wilbur Chen, University of Maryland School of Medicine. We're back Friday with State Circle, the latest on the protests and some very tight election races. Join us Friday at 7. Thanks for watching and have a good night.
Your health segments are a co-production of Maryland Public Television and the University of Maryland Medical System.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.